So again, hello everyone. I'm Candace Williams, Director of Major Gifts here at NatureServe. Thank you all for joining us today for our donor webinar to learn more about species habitat modeling. If you would like, please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from and tell us what the weather is like in your neck of the woods. Before we jump into the presentation, I'd like to take a moment to say thank you. Whether you are a longtime donor, a new supporter, or simply passionate about protecting biodiversity, your generosity and engagement make everything we do possible. So thanks for joining us. A few quick housekeeping notes before we dive in. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. I encourage you to use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. My colleagues will be helping moderate the chat, so you're welcome to talk with other participants or the panelists. She will also be sharing links to important information and resources throughout the session. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send the recording to all attendees and registrants tomorrow, so you can always revisit and share it with others. Real quick, let me take a moment to introduce NatureServe and our presenter. NatureServe's mission is to leverage the power of science, data, and technology to guide biodiversity conservation and stewardship. We are the authoritative source of data on threatened and endangered species and their habitats. This focus makes our data widely used by government and industry alike. But what truly sets NatureServe apart is our network of programs, comprised of more than 1,000 scientists across North America. Together, we collect, analyze, and distribute detailed scientific data about more than 100,000 species and ecosystems, pinpointing what exists, where it's found, and how it's doing. Today, our presenter, Dr. Max Tarjan, is the Director of Data Resources at NatureServe, where she leads the strategy and development of core biodiversity data assets that support conservation decision-making across North America. Trained as an ecologist, Max holds a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology with a background in vertebrate fieldwork and quantitative ecology. Her work focuses on advancing species habitat models and species data for imperiled plants and animals, with an emphasis on connecting biological information to real-world management and planning needs. She oversees NatureServe's Species Habitat Modeling Program, one of the largest libraries of habitat models for imperiled species, and is involved in modernizing data and modeling workflows through improved environmental data integration, climate envelope, and range shift modeling, and emerging AI and Earth observation methods. Most recently, she's using large language models to help fill data gaps and improve data quality for species attributes and conservation status ranks. So please join me in welcoming Max.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. It's great to see some familiar faces and happy to connect with new folks. Today, I'm going to talk about how mapping habitat for imperiled species is helping land managers decide where to act. So the decisions that people are making with these models help impact habitat conservation, listing and delisting under the Endangered Species Act, and other tangible outcomes for imperiled species throughout North America. NatureServe focuses on answering three key questions through the NatureServe network and the programs. So what is it? Identifying species and ecosystems. Where is it? And how is it doing? So what I'm specifically going to focus on today is why this focus on where is it. I'll talk you through NatureServe's Species Habitat Modeling Program and how that contributes to that understanding. Go over current applications of species habitat models for land management. How are these models being used? What's the impact that they're having? I'm also going to talk about a newer expansion of this program to predict the future using species habitat models. and talk about what the overall vision is for our model library and kind of what the steps are to reach that vision. So just to start out, why do we focus on where is it? This is really important for decisions that are made on the ground that impact imperiled species. So if we know where something is or where its habitat is, we know where to protect or restore habitat. Land managers also know where to avoid for other land uses. It gives an understanding of an organization's management responsibility for one or more species and who they can partner with in their efforts to support habitat for a species. It also allows a lot of our partners to strategically allocate limited resources to species that that organization can have a real impact on. And it for both our network programs as well as other partners who are doing other work on the ground, it helps predict where to look for other populations of very rare species. And with this new expansion into predicting the future, it helps predict the future suitability of habitat so that people who are doing conservation actions can select sites that have long-term resilience or stability in the habitat suitability for the species. And then just one other application, it does, these newer models also help us identify opportunities for assisted migration. So I'm going to talk about the species habitat modeling program, but let's start with what is a species habitat model and why would we want to create these? So it comes down to people in the fields. The network programs do a lot of on the ground work, and no one's able to visit every single site all the time. So we have a good understanding of where some of these important populations are for imperiled species, but we don't have a complete picture of where habitat is for the species or even where all of the populations are because you just can't survey everywhere. So species habitat models really help us fill this gap and have a much better understanding of where we think habitat is for the species and where there's likely to be other populations, because they associate known occurrences of a species with the environmental conditions at those sites to predict the distribution of habitat for the species across broad landscapes. So this gives us a full wall-to-wall picture of where habitat is based on the environmental characteristics at the site. So the way our modeling program works is there are two inputs that are really critical for species habitat models. One are the occurrence data, so places where we know a species exists. These data are collected by the NatureServe network programs, and that's really key. One of the things that's really special about NatureServe and the network methodology is that those locations don't just represent incidental sightings. So we're not talking about seeing a bald eagle in a parking lot. They're really representing places that are important to the conservation of the species and have real value to that conservation. So the occurrence data that we're dealing with are really high quality and expert reviewed. So that's the first input that's really critical to our program and success. And then, as I mentioned, we're associating those locations with their environmental predictors. So we've developed a suite of hundreds of environmental predictors that just characterize what things look like in terms of habitat conditions on the ground. So using those two inputs, we have a very streamlined and repeatable modeling workflow. It's all coded in R. And we're then able to create a model that can make predictions about where habitat exists on the ground, both where we know it already exists and also places where we haven't surveyed yet. So an output that you get from that is you can get a mapped output that shows areas of high probability habitat where those conditions are extremely similar to where we've observed on the ground, medium probability and lower probability habitat based on how similar the conditions are to where we've already made observations. I will say most modeling programs will kind of stop there. And another thing that's really key to the NatureServe modeling program is that we want to make these predictions, but we really want to know that they're matching expert understanding of what's happening on the ground. So we have a couple of additional steps to get there. One is a really key expert review process. So we have species experts look at these predictions that are these mapped outputs and give feedback on if it's matching their understanding of habitat in their area. And those reviews come back to NatureServe, and then we're able to make modifications to the model and to the outputs to make sure that we're matching as well as possible expert knowledge of where habitat exists for the species. And then the gold standard is to actually field validate these models. So a lot of our network programs and partners will use the models to try to identify new locations of the species, and they can go in the field and see how well the model is doing at predicting locations for species. And as we get that new occurrence data coming in through the network, we're then able to do this kind of circular iterative process where we update the model so that we have even better predictions that are more informed by additional location data. We've developed a suite of tools to make this program really strong. So one of the first is around engaging model reviewers, and we just have a model reviewer sign-up form that lists all of the species that have habitat models where we'd like an expert review. So reviewers from the NatureServe network, but also from our partner programs who are interested in using these models can go in and sign up to review species habitat models so that we can really get that expert knowledge into the process. Once someone signed up and they've been approved as an expert who is permitted to go and see those model outputs for sensitive species, then they go through this very structured tool to give really targeted feedback on the model outputs. So this is a view of our model outputs review tool, which is something that is created and maintained by NatureServe. And what you're seeing here is some of the information that a reviewer is given to evaluate how well a model is matching their understanding of habitat on the ground. So in the purple, you have those predictions, and then those black dots on the map are the actual occurrence records so that the reviewer has an understanding of what the data were that informed the model. And then they also get to review which environmental predictors were most important for the species and evaluate whether that makes sense or whether there's something that might be ecologically important that's missing that they would suggest adding in. So we now have run through this iterative revision process for quite a number of models, and we have a lot of data, which I always love playing around with. And what we see is that the how well the predictions match expert opinion really does go up as you go through this iterative revision process. So this is an example for just one species where we ran through 3 different model versions, and every time the model was revised based on expert review. So the experts give kind of a Yelp style rating from 1 to 5 stars, which indicates how well the predictions match their understanding of what's happening on the ground. And you can see that the area in red shows that high probability habitat. So that was adjusted quite a bit based on reviews that we got from experts. And that enabled us to bring that model from a rating of 3, indicating that it's useful, but not the best representation of habitat, all the way up to 5 stars, this is a really good representation of what we know about habitat for this species. The other huge value in interacting with reviewers is they give us comments that we have used to really improve the model approach and the methods. So I want to talk about one of these examples here because it's made a really big difference in the quality of what we're putting out, and this is just very new within the last year. So what we were hearing from reviewers is that sometimes they didn't feel like the model predictions were doing well because the species was in a habitat that was rapidly changing. So typically, and in the past, the modeling workflow would use environmental conditions from sort of the average year when we had observations across. So the observations will usually span about 30 years. And then around that mid-year, we'd take what the environmental conditions looks like and use that as the input. But what we were hearing from reviewers is that a lot of these habitats are seeing regular change. So through wildfire, land use conversion, so converting things to agriculture, converting things into developed lands. And that when you only use one snapshot in time of environmental conditions, you're not capturing all of those changes. And you might be mischaracterizing habitat that the species is using. So with support from a foundation, we made an update to the modeling workflow to expand our environmental predictors to not just represent a single point in time, but instead to do a time series, in particular for these predictors that are derived from the National Land Cover Database. So the National Land Cover Database shows different classes of habitat types or cover, and it's available annually. And it shows things like how much impervious surface there is. So that's essentially parking lots, concrete, how much deciduous forest cover you have, how much open cover you have. And this really does change in some locations quite quickly. And so what our team did is to prepare predictors for these different years so that you had a time series. And what that's allowed us to do is to, when we have an observation, match the conditions at the time the observation was made. So if we want to use an observation for model training that was made in 2010, we can actually use the information about what it looked like in 2010 at that point instead of using some average environmental condition. So now we have this workflow and this data set prepared, and we're applying it to all models moving forward. And I want to take a look at what the results of this have been and how it's really helped to improve our accuracy and help to make these outputs really high quality. So here's one example. This is a Florida scrub jay that we've run a couple of models for. And I'm comparing here the environmental predictors that were selected using our previous static land cover assumption versus the time matched model, which is the new approach. So previously, the old model that kind of just used average environmental conditions used impervious surface predictors, so concrete, as the fourth and fifth top predictor, and shrub cover was farther down on the list. So this is saying that if you want to find Florida scrub jay, look for concrete, and shrub cover is less important. But this is a Florida scrub jay, so that didn't make a whole lot of sense. So now that we're able to do this time-matched environmental predictors where we're actually looking at, all right, this bird was observed in this location at this time, what were the conditions then? Shrub cover is now the most important predictor, which is much more what you'd expect from an ecological sense. So we're seeing even in the predictors that are getting selected that there's a lot more ecological sense in what's getting selected. And then we're also hoping to get these reviewed so that we can validate that then the mapped predictions that we're getting out of this are more accurate and matching their understanding of what's happening on the ground better. The other very cool thing that this allows us to do is to look at how habitat has changed through time for a given species. So here I'm doing a comparison between two time points, 2005 and 2024. And those top green and tan maps just show what the land cover looked like. So that dark green is evergreen forest. And what you can see is that in certain areas over time, there's been a big loss of evergreen forest, and that has converted over to that tan color, which is shrub or scrub. So there's been some land change over this 20-year period. And we would expect then that a species that used evergreen forest would also have a change in how much habitat they had available to them. And that's what is shown in that bottom row with the purple, is that there's actually been a quite notable change in how much high probability habitat and habitat overall you're seeing for the species across that 20-year period. This kind of comparison is really only possible with this time-matched predictor approach where you have predictors available across a time series. So I think this is a really promising way to think about how habitat availability has changed for species in the past and could even inform how we're doing conservation status assessments for species. So I've gone over the modeling methodology, and I want to talk about what we've accomplished using this amazing workflow to date. So we now have a database behind all of our modeling work, which has enabled us to really make this information available to the public. So this species habitat modeling dashboard is a way that anyone in the public, but also any land manager who's interested in using habitat models for their work can go and see what's available. So this is kind of the landing page that just shows how many different best available models we have for different taxonomic groups. But then you can also do a lot of filtering on this to find out in my specific region how many ESA listed species have habitat models. But overall, the library includes over 2,500 imperiled plants and animals and one fungi at the moment, although we're hoping to expand that now that we have a chief mycologist or a head mycologist at NatureServe. So we have information for many imperiled species, and this dashboard provides access to which species have models, a lot of information about those models, like what were the data inputs, who's reviewed them, what organizations have reviewed them, and also links to this really informative metadata document about each model. So from the dashboard, users can go in and open this PDF document that tells them a lot about what this, how this model was made, and what kind of predictions it shows them. So this is an example for Yosemite toad. It shows people which predictors were most important for the model. There's also a mapped view of what those predictions look like. And very helpfully for a land manager, it helps translate how well the model performed, both in kind of the statistical sense in terms of how good those statistics are, and also what the expert reviewers said about the model. So it helps translate that into this estimate of model confidence that users can then use to interpret what can I use this model for. So if you have a low confidence model, it's very helpful for things like guiding field surveys, but you probably don't want to make your species translocations decisions based on a low confidence model. However, once you get all the way up to that high confidence, then you can make more precise decisions and ones that have kind of a greater impact, like doing environmental review. And so this document really helps both someone who does modeling, but also ultimately that end user who wants to apply the model to their conservation decision making. So what are the applications that we've thought about for the model dashboard? This allows our partners to go in and answer questions like which species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act have habitat models available in California, Oregon, and Washington. Which precise habitat models are already available to me as a federal government employee based on what project the model was created under. As a taxonomic expert, which of the models would benefit from my expert review? You can go and see which ones need review. And then also just searching by species. So is there a habitat model available for gopher frog? And if there is, what is its habitat protection status? One of the pieces of information that this dashboard also includes are some derived information that we get from the models, including the protection status of habitat for a species. So one of the tabs on the dashboard shows an analysis of all the predicted habitat for the species, what is the protection status, and then also what agencies or organizations are responsible for managing that habitat. So this is an example for the frosted flatwood salamander. And that donut chart on the left in green shows gap 1 and gap 2 status, which are protected. That blue and light blue are kind of multi-use areas that have some protection, but also other uses. And then the gray is just areas that are not represented in the this database that lists protected areas. And then on the right, what we can see about this species is that the U.S. Forest Service is responsible for managing almost 42% of the habitat. So they have primary responsibility for the majority of any organization. But then a close second is Department of Defense has about 31% of that habitat within their installation footprints. So what this helps is it helps agencies identify how much impact could I have on habitat for this species, and also who else should I be talking to? Who else has high responsibility for habitat based on that overlap with the lands that they're managing. I'm going to go through a couple of other model applications and how people are using these models to do their work. So one that's just useful for any given species habitat model is to help guide field surveys. So here in red, we have areas of high habitat suitability, and then the black dots are locations where the species has already been observed and we already have NatureServe location data for those points. So what you can see is that these areas that are circled in blue are places where there is high probability habitat available as predicted by the model, but we don't yet have any observations confirming that this species is present in those places. So this can really help people identify, okay, if I'm going to kind of schedule my field surveys and plan them out, where are promising areas that I could look that would give me additional information beyond the places where I already know that this species exists. So that's what you can do with a single model. There's also a lot of applications that you can do by using multiple models all together, and I'm going to talk through some of those. So many of you might have heard of this product, but I'm going to just give an overview of the map of biodiversity importance for those who haven't. So the idea of the map of biodiversity importance is that we use thousands of these models for different species and stack them all together to get a map that shows multi-species richness and information. So using this approach, each kind of pixel will have different values that can be used for different purposes. So the most basic that you could map out is species richness, which just shows the overall number of imperiled species in a given location. For this project, we also provide range size rarity, which allows you to see which species have should be prioritized for conservation. So it weights it by range size. So what that means is that plants and animals that have limited distributions contribute to higher scores. So when you get kind of a hotspot, that means there are a lot of imperiled species here and they're range restricted. So you really should prioritize actions here because there aren't other opportunities for those species elsewhere. And then there's also a layer for protection weighted range size rarity, which takes into account the degree to which the species is already protected. And here's a look at what maps like that look like. So we've done this throughout all of CONUS at a very high spatial resolution. And managers who are especially doing work across multiple jurisdictions can use this to identify places that have really high imperiled species diversity, have restricted ranges, and or are not protected, and identify places where they might want to take certain actions or avoid certain actions. I will also say that this This map has been incorporated into a number of prioritization exercises by other organizations, and it is freely available to anyone through our Open Data Hub. So anyone who wants to use this information can, and we've updated it at this point. There's been 2 iterations, and we're hoping to continue to update it into the future as we have more observations come in, and then the models are updated as well. Another tool I want to talk about is supports the Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System. This is one of my favorite applications of models. So I hope many of you have been able to visit a National Wildlife Refuge System. I am located in the Bay Area, so I have the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge System close by, and for years did water bird surveys there and breeding bird surveys, and worked with Western snowy plovers breeding in that location. These are really special places that are set aside to protect wildlife. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has different areas where it's not yet part of a refuge, but they're able to acquire that land if they have funds available. So they are faced with decisions about where to acquire lands to expand the refuge system. And they have a few criteria for kind of trying to identify the most promising places. Prior to getting access to NatureServe information through this tool, the only species information that was going into this was for migratory birds. So all of those other imperiled species that were not migratory birds really weren't represented in a formalized way. It was just based on expert opinion, which is just difficult to replicate and have a real good comparison. So what NatureServe was able to do is to create this tool that tells the National Wildlife Refuge System what the biodiversity value is for a given acquisition area and in their existing refuges as well. So this is fed by models, and it enables someone who works in the refuge system to click on a geographic area that they might be considering for acquisition. They get to see how many imperiled species exist there, taxonomic breakdowns, whether any of them are ESA listed or not, what the NatureServe conservation status is of those species, and then also gives them the full list of species that are known to occur there or have habitat predicted there. The other thing this does is tells them how important this location is for each species. So we do that primarily using those habitat models. So if that land area contains 100% of habitat for a species, it's going to show up as really high importance. Like if you protect this area, it will have a very big impact on the species. If that acquisition area only has, let's say, 3% of the habitat, then it might be just lower importance for the species. Like there is habitat there, but if you really want to focus on the species, you could focus efforts elsewhere. It gives them a lot of really rich information so that they can choose locations that are going to have the most impact on imperiled species overall, and also on specific species that they're trying to target. Another application for one of our partners for species habitat models is to help the Bureau of Land Management prioritize which species they want to focus on, and also where they want to focus their efforts. So the Bureau of Land Management has a list of over 3,000 what they call special status species. Those include everything within BLM managed lands that's listed under the Endangered Species Act, and also a number of other species that have a high conservation status rank or are important to BLM. So one of the primary questions that BLM wants to answer is, how much impact can BLM have on a species? Because they really want to invest their dollars in things that they can really have a measurable impact on. So we, again, use species habitat models to tell them what their responsibility is for species habitat. So is BLM managing lands for 100% of the habitat or only 3%? And that helps with them prioritize species, as well as many other criteria that are applied through the process. So that kind of helps to select species that BLM can have the biggest impact on. And then separately, they also want to know, where should we be working? And that's where this aggregation across multiple species comes in. So we've produced custom maps that are similar to the idea of the map of biodiversity importance, but they really focus in on BLM special status species around BLM managed lands, so that BLM can see where are their hotspots of special status species in areas that they have control over, and also where are there species, concentrations of species that they can have a really big impact on based on their prioritization scheme. So again, just the value here is it allows them to identify these spatial hotspots of whatever they're looking for. So whether it be all special status species, those that are specifically ESA listed, or those that fall in the BLM's defined priority tier. And this really helps them facilitate efficient and effective multi-species management. I am going to move us to this kind of expansion that I talked about in our modeling approach, where we are now not only predicting where habitat exists right now, but also what habitat will look like into the future. So in the last year or so, we have created a workflow to create climate envelope models using all of the same great infrastructure that we use for other species habitat models. So these models define a climate envelope, which is the range of climate variables that align with the species observed distribution. So basically, where do we have climate conditions that support this species? And then with that, we're able to project potential distribution under either current or future climate scenarios. And this helps us predict range shifts for species into the future, and also understand how stable habitat is in a given location as you look into the future. So the approach that we use, this figure is from the IPCC report, which just shows that there are multiple global climate models that people use, and they all make different assumptions and they have slightly different outputs and kind of predictions on how warm different places will get at what rates. So to account for that variability and what the future might look like, we use multiple different global climate models. So we're applying multiple of these and kind of looking at what the predictions are and how much agreement there is between the different global climate models. So we make predictions about what habitat distribution will look like under different scenarios for warming levels. So what we've been focusing on is warming of 2 degrees Celsius and warming levels of 3 degrees Celsius. And because warming rate differs by what global climate model you have, those models reach those warming levels in slightly different years. So we started out with an expert review process to choose the right species to pilot this kind of modeling with. So far we've run this for 12 species. These were selected based on their life history traits and experts within NatureServe that basically we were looking for species where we could accurately characterize what climate conditions they do well under. And the outputs that we're creating are maps showing where we expect habitat that's currently suitable to become unsuitable in the future. So that would be an area of habitat contraction. Places where we expect the habitat to remain stable, so it's currently suitable and it will remain suitable into the future. and then also areas where there might be habitat expansion. So those are places where those conditions aren't currently suitable, but in the future, under these global climate models, they'll become suitable. The other thing that we wanted to help users and land managers understand is under these different scenarios, how far the species could actually disperse on their own without assistance. So we used natural history information to calculate this. And you'll see some kind of concentric circles on the maps for the outputs that I'm going to show you. And I just want to explain what those mean. So the purple circle here is the area that contains all of the known observations of the species. And then the blue area is where we presume it could contain habitat from the past up until now. The yellow area is how far, based on life history, so dispersal distance and generation time, the species could get under a 2 degrees Celsius warming scenario. So, and then the orange is how far that species could get by the time we predict that there would be 3 degrees Celsius of warming. So these are the kinds of outputs that we are able to provide to people based on these models. This is the mapped prediction from these climate envelope models. And these are really cool. This is the first time that this information has ever been displayed this way. So the blue areas are places where that's those contraction areas. So the current conditions are suitable, but in the future, they're not going to be suitable anymore. And we can expect that that habitat will be lost just based on the climate conditions. The green areas are places that are currently suitable and will remain suitable into the future. So the appropriate conditions are expected to persist. And then there's not much yellow here, but those kind of light white yellowish areas are places where it's not currently suitable, but climate conditions in the future may become suitable in the future. So the species potentially could expand into those areas. The other thing that you'll notice here is that there's gradation in how deep the color is. And this is a really cool way to communicate how much agreement there is between the predictions from those multiple global climate models. So if it's a really deep color, it means based on every global climate model and every prediction that we have, there's agreement that this is the most likely scenario, that this is, let's say the deep green means, yeah, we're pretty confident that habitat here will persist. Whereas when you get into those very light colors, that's where the models have less agreement between them. So we're showing the most likely outcome, but if it's a lighter color, it means there's less model agreement, so we have less certainty there. And I think this is a really powerful and useful way to communicate both what we expect to happen, but also the certainty that we have in that happening. These models are also available on the model dashboard. So you can see that we have those models for 12 pilot species, and they have their own special metadata associated with them that describe what kind of a model this is and how to use it, and that it's really for looking forward and making predictions into the future. So what are the applications of these climate envelope models? There are a number of very cool things that you can do with these. So it allows you to estimate and compare the vulnerability of species to future change. Because what we can do is look at how much we expect habitat to expand or contract in the future for a species. And that can be used to kind of inform if a species might be vulnerable to climate change or not, and to what degree. Also key to a lot of our decision makers is that they can assess the stability of habitat suitability at a site of interest. So if they're considering taking action, especially conservation action for a species at a particular site, they can reference these models to ask themselves, is the habitat likely to remain within the climate envelope? Will this remain suitable into the future? Because they don't want to invest in places where in a couple of decades, the climate conditions might become unsuitable at that site. So it can really help with this informed decision making that will last in the longer term. And then it also helps land managers explore potential for assisted migration or translocation. So I'm just going to go back to that map to talk through that a little bit. So the two inner black outlines on this map are showing where the current habitat distribution is. And then that larger single outline, black outline shows with 2 degrees of warming, that is the area in which this species could by itself feasibly disperse. What you can see is that there are outside of that dispersal area some green areas that are currently suitable and likely to be suitable in the future. So if this was a species where people were thinking about, to really make sure that the species persists, we would like to do translocations or have assisted migration. This can help them identify both where they might want to look, where the climate might be suitable in the future for that assisted migration. And it can also help them understand how far away from current locations they might want to look to do either assisted migration versus places where the species is going to be able to reach naturally based on its natural dispersal distance. And then because these models are a bit unique and really useful for different applications, we've developed this very lovely user guide for folks who are not modelers, but they're trying to use these models to make decisions. And we go through each of those use cases and talk about how they can be used, what the caveats are, what they need to understand when they're trying to use these models for decision making. And one of the ways that I see this information, once we expand the models available for this, being useful is to do some of that future looking and understand the stability of decisions. So we've already seen this National Wildlife Refuge System tool. And what I've done here is just a mock-up of what it might look like if this is also future informed. So I've changed the table at the bottom. And what is now in that bottom right corner of the table is you can see the value of this location for the species under current conditions. And you can also see how that value changes over time with these different warming scenarios. So if you were able to integrate this into tools like this, then managers could see both, all right, currently this place is important, and in the future, it's actually going to become even more important to the species because maybe their range is going to contract, but it's going to persist right here. So it will allow them to identify places that either will become more important or become less important over time where they might want to avoid for investing in their conservation dollars. All right, so those are the applications. Now I want to talk about the overall goal of the modeling program. We have done a lot and it's been very fun and productive. We also have this ambitious goal of having a comprehensive library of habitat models for imperiled species. So wanted to show where we are right now in meeting that goal. These donut charts show are broken into 2 kind of categories, the globally ranked 1 and globally ranked 2. So the most imperiled NatureServe rankings species, as well as broken down by plants and animals. So we can see that for plants, we are hovering right around half or slightly less of half of imperiled plants have habitat models. So the green portion shows how many of those have a best available model in library already. And then for animals, we're closer to a quarter of species that have models completed. And then I can also show a geographic view of this by state. So these numbers and the color gradient show the proportion of species that have been modeled. And these are species that are imperiled native plants and animals that occur in the US and are and occur within those states. So there is quite a bit of variation geographically. At the lower end, we've modeled like 20% of the species in some states, up to 60% of the species that regularly occur in some other states. There are a number of ways that we can fill and complete the library. Some of it is supporting NatureServe and doing the modeling ourselves. Another way is the network programs. Many of them have active modeling programs, and we've been working with them to do exchange of model information so that we can show models by network programs in the species habitat model dashboard. And that is especially important for species that only occur in a single state, where the best available model might be with that network program. And this allows people who want to use models to know that that model exists in a state and to know who to contact to get access to it. So in my mind, completing the library doesn't have to be NatureServe on its own. It kind of can certainly come from other sources, and we're really happy to be working with a few programs right now to represent what all of the work that they've been doing in the dashboard, so that these folks that are trying to make decisions across multiple jurisdictions know that there are models available for especially those species that only occur within one state from those programs. All right, so how to support the modeling program and these efforts that I've talked about. Your donations to NatureServe will support us with expanding the model library. As I mentioned, we really want to do updates to the map of biodiversity importance on a regular basis to keep that current. All of this work relies on core data on taxonomy, conservation status, and distribution. And also, we want to make this information as readily available to decision makers as possible. So your donations support improving platforms for that data sharing and overall just science-based conservation of North American biodiversity. And I will hand this off to Candace. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a pleasure to talk with you all.
Okay, thank you so much, Max. Every time I hear about this work, I'm reminded how powerful good data truly is. So I hope today gave you a clear picture of how NatureServe science helps turn information into real conservation decisions. Behind every map you saw, every model you saw today is a tremendous amount of work and a community of supporters like you who make that work possible. We had a lot of questions come in, and I know we don't have a lot of time. Before we open it up for those questions, I just want to tell you about a few simple ways you can stay connected. One of the easiest ways to stay involved is simply to stay connected with us via social media. If you follow NatureServe on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or X, you'll see stories from our network scientists and examples of how biodiversity data is being used in the real world. Finally, if today's webinar inspired you, I'd like to invite you to consider supporting NatureServe's work. Everything Max shared today, from species habitat models to the dashboard, depend on a strong foundation of biodiversity data. Keeping that data current is what allows us to provide these clear, trusted answers about where species are most at risk and where conservation action matters most. So support from donors like you helps make that possible. So let me jump in. I want to thank everyone again for being here today and answer a few of these questions. If we can't get to your question right now, I promise we will follow up with you after the presentation to make sure you have an answer. Let's see. So I'm going to try to maybe combine some of these quickly, Max. Some of our donors are interested in knowing more about the models themselves and the data. So we know that a lot of species habitat modeling and distribution models are out there with other conservation and environmental organizations. What really sets NatureServe's models apart? And do you use any citizen science to influence your models?
Yeah, those are great questions. So there are a few things that sets our models apart. One of them I already mentioned, which is the network occurrence data that we used. That's already very expert reviewed, and we have very high confidence that those locations have important habitat for the species. So just the data quality going in stands out. The other is certainly our model review process. So the network programs contribute their expertise to that review. And I don't know of any other organization that has that kind of network of experts to draw from to improve their model outputs. As I mentioned, a lot of times species distribution modeling kind of ends with the prediction, and they're not going through multiple that iterative process and potentially not field validating. And the scale at which we're able to do that because of the tools that we have, but also that network of experts is quite great. And also, we've invested a lot in a quite custom modeling workflow. So as I mentioned, we're constantly making upgrades, like the kind of time matching of environmental predictors that I mentioned. So we're just improving over time, and then doing this for thousands of species. We've learned a ton along the way. In terms of the citizen science data, yes, we do make use of citizen science data. So in some cases, especially the more common species aren't tracked by all network programs. So sometimes we do have data gaps. And a really good way for us to fill those is to look to citizen science data. When we do that, we often have experts review those inputs to make sure that they're correctly identified and in expected locations. And inherent in our modeling approach is we actually have a weighting scheme. So we give more emphasis to network data than to citizen science data, just because of that difference in confidence. And again, I don't know of other modeling programs that have a similar weighting like that, where they're indicating that some data should be emphasized over others when you're creating the model.
Okay, thanks, Max. And I know we're at time here, but I would like to give you the opportunity to quickly go over a few of these resources, which our donors had some questions about. So where can they find these habitat models that identify species in their area, and some of these other resources as well?
Yeah, so the QR codes will take you right to the correct location. So as I mentioned, that map of biodiversity importance is freely available through our open data hub. The species habitat model dashboard is a place that has a lot of filters you can apply to find exactly the species that you're interested in and evaluate whether there's a model, and then open that metadata to learn more about the model. And then anyone in the public can go and make an account on NatureServe Explorer Pro, and that allows you to see kind of some upscaled model outputs. So you can see the output from the model as well as the metadata. And that allows you to kind of draw an area of interest on the map, and then use those models to see which species have habitats in your area of interest. So if you want to do that for your wherever you live, you can kind of check out where we're predicting habitat for various species using that tool.
Great. Okay, thank you, Max, for everything today, and thank you everyone for joining us. Again, if we could not get to your question, either Max or myself will follow up with you to make sure that we get you an answer. So thanks again, and everyone have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.